Good morning and welcome to the Indoor Environments Global Research to Action Show. I'm your co-host, Bob Krell. I'm the publisher and founder of Healthy Indoors Magazine, and joining me as my co-host is Donald Weeks. He is the president of the IEQGA, the Indoor Environmental Quality Global Alliance, coming to us live from Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. Hey, Don.
Hey, how are you today?
It's another great day here in Syracuse. It's actually sunny and it's not raining, so I feel good about that.
There you go.
So today's show is another great one. It's our second installment of our new series for ISIAC and IEQGA. So we're really excited to have as our guest today, Dr. David Krause. He's the founder and principal toxicologist for Healthcare Consulting and Contracting, HC3, in Tallahassee, Florida. He's a certified industrial hygienist and received his doctorate in environmental and occupational health and master's of science in public health from the University of South Florida. For over 25 years, he has practiced environmental science and public health, focusing on toxicology, occupational health, industrial hygiene, indoor air quality, exposure to microbes and chemicals in homes, schools, office buildings, and healthcare facilities. From 2008 to 2011, Dr. Krause was the State Toxicologist for the Florida Department of Health, and he led statewide response efforts on community cancer clusters, corrosive drywall in homes, and the Deepwater Horizon Oil Spill. So that's a whole bunch of stuff. So welcome, David Krause. How are you?
I'm well. Thanks for inviting me today.
This is, the topic of today's show really is kind of a long title, but, the crux to this is there's potentially issues in your potable water systems that you're receiving from your municipalities that might be adversely affecting your indoor environment and ultimately your health, right?
That's certainly the case. We've focused for many years on the impact of outdoor air, on indoor air, on building materials, on the indoor air and the environment and exposures people have. We often forget or don't place adequate importance on the water quality. And what comes in with that water can certainly affect people as much, if not more, than the contaminants and agents present in the air and being emitted from building materials.
I mean, one of the things I think that the audience may not know is, because some people may not be familiar with you. Obviously, we've known each other for years. Don's known you for years because you've been a kind of a fixture in the IEQ industry. But for a global audience, some people might not be familiar with you. How did you get involved? What got your interest to be involved in public health and indoor air quality and industrial hygiene? How did you get here?
Well, that's a great question. I've been asked that a few times by my employees and by my kids. Actually, my first exposure to public health and environmental health came when I was an officer in the U.S. Army. I was stationed in northern Germany in a town called Flensburg, and was responsible for the health and safety of all of my soldiers. And as a lieutenant, was given responsibility for the mess hall and the barracks and for even the battlefield that we would have to fight on. And you realize that in most wars, on any given day, you had more soldiers unavailable or out from combat due to disease or foodborne illness than you did from combat injuries. So it became a very important aspect of just daily life on an Army base or in the military. And actually, I got a chance to work with epidemiologists. They were studying why did certain occupational specialties such as artillerymen, forward observers, why did they have a higher incidence rate of injuries to their legs, sprained ankles, broken ankles. And so that's some of my first exposures to what turns out to be the field of public health.
So the follow-up, of course, I have to that is, what are you most widely known for now in the global stage? I know the answer, but I'd like to have you answer it.
Well, these days it's probably related to waterborne pathogens and Legionnaires disease. Since I was State Toxicologist working with the Florida Department of Health, I and my colleagues recognized that the current guidelines certainly weren't working, weren't sufficient, and needed to be improved. Recognized the need for better training and better protocols, and bringing the actions of that to a more modern state of response and remediation. But in prior days, I dealt with the Chinese drywall, or the corrosive drywall that was being imported. Prior to that, some people may have heard some of the work I did early on with candles and candle soot that became the subject of consumer product recalls and issues related to lead and soot from candles. So there's been a few emerging issues I've gotten a chance to work on.
So Dave, going back some, when did you first become interested in Legionnaires' disease? And if you could kind of give us maybe an example of something that you did back in the days that led to your interest in Legionnaire.
Well, back early in my career, I was with the Florida Department of Health as the industrial hygienist. So I would be sent out to do field investigations of outbreaks of various types, and Legionnaires was one of them. I was certainly asked to investigate. Before it was commonplace to do a proactive investigation of sources before you had any cases of disease, and recognize that we didn't have any reliable guidance or recommendations on how to interpret values. But my major efforts came to me when I was working with the Florida Department of Health as a state toxicologist, and saw the dearth of guidance and training that was out there, and that the rates were rapidly rising. During that, soon after that period, 2012, the rates of Legionnaire's disease certainly started to rise again, as they had in 2002, 2003, and to where we've seen over the past 15, 16 years, over 600% increase in rates of disease. So whatever we're doing isn't working. And so I figured that's something we should be working on as industrial hygienists and public health officials to improve how we're trying to prevent and remedy this the source of disease.
And in these outbreaks that you've investigated, what was the impact on the indoor environment?
Well, it can be pretty severe. I mean, Legionnaire's disease, a lot of people don't realize that that this kills people. This causes fatalities. Most indoor air pollutants we deal with, rarely, if ever, are attributable to fatalities. But with Legionnaires, a non-healthcare setting, a 1 in 10 case mortality rate is common. And if it's a healthcare setting, or such as a nursing home or a hospital, 1 in 4 people who contract the disease often pass from it. So that's serious outcomes, and it often hospitalizes people. The indoor environments, what we find is we don't have a way of surveilling the indoor environment, measuring this in the air. So we have to take that second step and go and look for sources and monitor for possible sources of exposure.
So you mentioned that you really can't measure this in the air. Could you give us a little description as to why that is the case?
Yeah, I would say we probably know less about that than others. But what we believe is happening is that the organism is damaged or made non-viable or non-culturable, at least, by the sample collection methodologies we have available to us. So it desiccates pretty quickly. When it dries out on the plate or in the air, it's believed to not to be able to grow on that plate, and therefore we can't see it in the current analyses. So that's probably the most likely explanation of why air sampling for Legionella rarely gives us reliable results. You can sometimes detect it if you're near a source, but the methodologies we have, the plates, the number of samples that have to be collected, and probably the transient, periodic, episodic nature. It's not constantly in the air. You have to catch it out of the air like a cloud. It's not a very reliable method to find it. You're better off looking at the possible sources.
But I mean, that's the case with trying to catch airborne bacteria in general, right? I mean, it's air sampling for bacteria is always kind of hit and miss and sketchy.
Yeah, yeah. We could certainly do with a much better surveillance or monitoring methodology. Until that comes along, until that is validated, then what we have to rely upon is the source. Looking at the sources where we know it grows and amplifies. And when it does that, then we can actually take steps to prevent it. Because even if you catch it in the air, even if you could detect it in the air, finding where the source is to remediate it and mitigate its risk still would require source sampling.
Yeah, I mean, that makes total sense because you find it in the air. Well, you're taking a general shotgun sample. So now where is it coming from?
Right.
That's great. I mean, I guess that would maybe give you a better idea of the actual exposure, but not necessarily, right? Because people are exposed numerous ways, right? It's usually when water's aerosolized. That's usually the case.
That's what we believe. The primary source of exposure that causes disease, which is Legionnaires disease, is a type of pneumonia. And we contract it not by drinking the water, but by inhaling the water. So that's the main pathway and the main disease that we believe is related to this.
So, David, I had an opportunity a couple of years ago to India, and before I went, I was asked, what I asked and did some research on Legionella and India. And it was interesting to me to find that although they had hundreds of thousands of cases of pneumonia of various types, they only reported one case a year of Legionella. I was wondering if that's the case. I mean, we're kind of somewhat North American centric here. Is it something different in other parts of the world, at least in your knowledge or experience?
Yeah, I kind of describe Legionnaires disease as a first world problem, not a third world problem. We have created indoor environments and equipment, industries and materials that favor Legionella more so than other bacteria in the water. We've created a synthetic artificial environment in hot water. So this is a problem of indoor plumbing, hot water, potable water, municipal water supplies, treated water, in which we've removed the competing organisms. We have warmed the water, and then we recirculate that water, and then we try to save that water. And I think this is a problem that man has created that isn't probably much of a problem in nature. But turns out this organism has found a nice, safe environment and also happens to cause disease in humans. So, yeah, this is one in which we've, in many ways, brought upon ourselves.
So I wanted to point out, those of you watching the show live now, if you're on the Healthy Indoors Online Global Community, we do have a chat area there, and you're welcome to pose some questions for Dr. Krause. We'd be happy to bring those up on the show live or even address those afterwards. So by all means, take your opportunity to do that. I cut you off, didn't I, Don?
No, go for it. But you did that. Basically, I wanted to ask David about whether there are other waterborne pathogens that he has found that impact the indoor environment.
Well, there's a number. I mean, there's many other bacteria, such as including Pseudomonas. There's some fungi that are transmitted via waterborne roots. So there's, with the recent mandate by CMS, the Centers for Medicaid Services, that hospitals and healthcare settings must control and prevent waterborne infections. I think that will prompt more organizations to look. The more we look, the more we're likely to find. But there's a number of bacteria that can be transmitted through those pathways. And then something that is a bit of, I'd say, emerging as a recognized waterborne pathogen are non-tuberculosis mycobacteria, NTMs. And Mycobacterium avium complex is one example of that. And they often can grow in similar environments, very robust and resilient organisms that can also cause disease and can amplify within water systems.
Yeah, so these sort of things, we don't typically think of those indoor environmental issues. I mean, they're considered, these waterborne pathogens. I would say, most indoor environmental practitioners, don't necessarily look at those as, bona fide IAQ or IEQ type issues. So what you're suggesting is that really we're missing the boat on that a little.
Well, I think we've been blind to that as a source for decades because we haven't been required to test for it. It's not required to be tested under the Safe Drinking Water Act. And, the conditions that allow it to grow, all of these things to amplify within building water systems and sometimes within industrial water systems. That's certainly been a window into the conditions and the risks of this when we're dealing with fluids that are used for cutting or for cooling inside of industrial plants. Mm-hmm. As an industrial hygienist, I've had the opportunity to investigate some of these, and the amount of contaminants, bacteria, NTMs that are in some of these cutting fluids that are recirculated over and over and over can be astonishing.
Well, they're not changed very often either. A lot of those fluids, they're maintained. They're cooling fluids, so they're maintained at warm temperatures, right? Because they're part of their deal is to actually transfer heat away from whatever the process is they're working with.
Yeah, and cutting fluids are just constantly being, have debris and nutrients added into them. There's heat, so those have certainly added to my experience and seeing how those things can be aerosolized and inhaled by workers. So yeah, industrial environments, non-traditional, non-typical, atypical from healthcare or residential environments certainly recognize a certain risk there. And then when somebody contracts one of these diseases, which usually is respiratory, then the question is, where do they get it? And then that's often led to us looking at homes, looking at transportation or hotels and resorts, and then we realize these things are everywhere. So dose does make the poison, and the infectious dose is needed, but we realize that these are not uncommon. We just haven't been looking for them for a long time.
So I have to go back to what you mentioned a moment ago, that testing for Legionella is actually not part of the Safe Water Act?
Correct.
This is something that I bet many people are not aware of. Because I find it alarming that we're not testing for that. So,
yeah, it's a bit of a conundrum. They are supposed to control it, but it's based upon treatment technology. So they believe, and this is often stated in the Federal Register. We believe that if we treat it this certain way, have adequate disinfectant levels and at the right pH and the right temperatures, that this will be controlled. But currently, under the Safe Drinking Water Act, there is no requirement for the municipal water supply to test for Legionella or several others. So, so then becomes it must be coming from the building. Well, it had to get in the building somehow. And there's a number of studies. I think I gave a presentation recently on the data at the American Industrial Hygiene Association on the last virtual conference, the frequency of finding Legionella in municipal water supplies. And it's pretty common. In investigations of outbreaks, we've certainly found it, and in long-term surveillance, in Baltimore, we found Legionella in the incoming water 30% of the time, roughly.
That's really troubling. 30% of the time you're finding it in the incoming water.
Yeah, and in a few of those incidences, which were spaced apart by months, sometimes a 3 to 4 months, we would find Legionella at levels that would have prompted a building to be remediated if that had been detected during an outbreak. So not just incidental, barely detectable 1, 2, 5, but up to 40 colony forming units per mil of Legionella in the incoming water. And that's a bit of a shock to a lot of people that, facilities can be seeded with this constantly, or at least sporadically, by the municipal water system.
Yeah, so with concerns about airborne pathogens rising, obviously, what are we missing with regards to water pathogens and human health? Should we be looking as industrial hygienists or any other type of, say, building owner or maintenance company? What should we be looking for that we are missing at the moment?
Well, the current, I'll say, directions and trend is to establish water management programs. Mm-hmm. These are believed to be, they're entirely new and recommendations from ASHRAE under the 188 standard to basically pay attention to and monitor to your building water systems to make sure they have adequate disinfectant, they're at the right temperatures, and they're periodically maintained or flushed to keep them clean. It's being adopted slowly and under a lot of duress by a lot of facilities, but it costs money and the outcome is tough to demonstrate. But I think that's going to be the biggest aspect: is how do you implement these programs for facilities that don't think they have a problem?
Well, a lot of cases when we did these types of water management plans and programs, a lot of people said, "Well, when does it all end? When does it stop?"
Never.
Yeah, and then that's what we pretty much told them. But they were like, "Well, how much testing should we do? Should we be testing monthly? Should we be testing quarterly? Should we be testing every day?" And those questions are not real clear. I mean. You mentioned the ASHRAE standard, and it's certainly a decent and a good standard. We'll all agree with that. But it doesn't really tell you what you're supposed to do to kind of maintain your systems. And maybe you want to comment on that a little bit.
Well, I'll tout the horn of the American Industrial Hygiene Association. I was a member of the group that prepared and edited the first guidance back in 2015. We saw that the ASHRAE standard was, for many reasons, not providing that type of detailed guidance and granularity on how and when to sample or to assess. So the 2015 AIHA guidelines, especially Chapter 3, on assessing building water systems for Legionella sources is a pretty good source to start with. I think we put out there, starting with quarterly monitoring is a good place to start for most buildings. And then adjusting that based upon the data that you collect. You may be able to increase the time between monitoring, or you may need to increase the frequency of testing. How and where to sample. Most people don't even know where to start with that. So we provided some beginning guidance on how that can and should be done. But it is important for the team to adjust course based upon their findings.
Right. Well, that's important. And I guess the question becomes, in many cases, they're looking for a negative. It's part of the problem of industrial hygiene. You're always looking for a negative rather than, oh, I found something. What happens when they do find something? What are they, in terms of particularly the building owner or maintenance company, what are they supposed to do? What's the next steps?
Well, the one for sure thing we say is don't ignore it. That's a good way to get into trouble and have things backfire on you. But overreacting is also not good. Wasting of time and resources for a transient concentration or detection certainly isn't desired either. So, we provided some guidance on, watchful waiting, taking action early. So that's one of the things that we've done, that AIHA has provided. And most recently, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has actually published some guidance with interpretive values and guidance on actions that should go on. So I think we're gaining more confidence in what you should do when you detect the thing you're looking for, and how you can take actions to reduce the risk. There's no such thing as zero risk. There's no such thing as zero detection. I think there's no one right answer. The actions you may take in a cancer treatment ward or an ICU for a hospital for a certain detectable level are going to be different from what you would do if you're working, on an aircraft hangar or at a prison or at an office building where the risks are different.
Mm-hmm. So we have a question posed in the chat from our studio, from our actually live audience. Jim Flores asks, what is your opinion on the use of whole genome sequencing for Legionella versus PCR or traditional culture?
Yeah, great question. Great question. We've certainly encountered this in some of the outbreaks that we dealt with. And this is an aspect in which essentially you're reading the DNA fingerprint of the organisms that you're finding in the environmental samples from the water systems or cooling towers, and comparing it hopefully to isolates that have been collected from patients, from individuals who've contracted the disease. It's not one or the other. You have to find the isolates, you have to grow it out first. So you're going to be doing culture testing there. PCR testing, it's wrapped in all kind of problems and concerns. One of the things is that it tends to detect both live and dead, culturable and non-culturable, viable, non-viable organisms. So out of the same sample, you may get 1 million cell equivalents under PCR, but when you plate that out, you detect 1 CFU per mil. So vastly different concentrations and interpretations. PCR has a role, but when it comes to examining the organisms for the risk of disease, we still have to rely upon culture.
So, you've done extensive work over the years with AIHA and the ACGIH, American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists. I always have a hard time saying that fast, but it starts to roll off your tongue after a while. And you've worked with a bunch of other groups too. So, what are some of the standards and guidelines? Additional ones that you've been working on over the years, and in particular, ones that you think would have a big impact on how we deal with our indoor environments, for investigation and remediation purposes.
Certainly. Well, a document that was published, say early on in my career, it's been a while ago now, the ACGIH Bioaerosols Assessment and Control. I think it was published in 1999. I've been asked to participate and invited to sit on the Bioaerosols Committee for ACGIH, in which we are, I'm one of many, trying to update that 20-plus-year-old document. Now, that was a foundational, great document that when it was published, and it's still very solid in its documentation and scientific guidance, and even transitioning from research to practice. But there's been a lot that's gone on since then, and we're trying to update that text and reference and that foundation even today. So that one's going to take a little while, but that's one that has been labor of love for many, including Don Weeks. I know you're working on that with us as well. That's been a great experience. Most recently, though, the American Industrial Hygiene Association put out the technical framework on Legionella, in which we have worked in conjunction with the National Environmental Health Association, and are trying to also engage with APIC, Association for Professionals in Infection Control, in which we're really laying out the fundamentals, the core competencies and principles that individuals should have when they're filling the roles of either a technician who's collecting samples for Legionella, or a professional who is designing water management plans and programs, or an environmental health professional or an industrial hygienist who's conducting investigations of sources related to an outbreak. So it's not a credential, but it is laid out to provide the information you would need or should have as a credentialed professional, and maybe used someday as a curriculum.
Makes sense. One thing I just wanted to bring up now, I think it's germane, is the Healthy Buildings America conference coming up in November, which of course is part of the ongoing series that ISIAC, the International Society of Indoor Air Quality and Climate, produces. And this year it's being hosted by CIRI, the Cleaning Industry Research Institute. It's in Honolulu, Hawaii from November 9th to 11th. And the focus this year is a little different. It's bridging the gap between research and practice, not unlike what we're trying to do here in the show. This is a unique event in that there will be academia, researchers, and people from that entire academic research community there. But in addition, we anticipate they'll be joined by a lot of practitioners from around the world and have the opportunity to share ideas and thoughts. So I think that's a great thing. You'll be there. You're doing a pre-conference workshop, right?
I am.
Don will be there. I'll be there.
Well, what else do you need?
You should all be. Yeah, and the thing is, you really should all be there. This is a great event. You can learn more at hb2021-america.org. That's where you can find out about it. Still plenty of time to register to attend. So hope to see you there. And
yeah. I tell you, I've been attending these conferences since the late 90s.
You're that old? What?
I'm old. I went there in high school.
I wish I could say that. First one I went to was in 1993. So,
I remember the one in Helsinki.
Yeah.
And that's
where I met my wife, actually.
Oh, well, a lot of good things happened there. I met some Danish fellows who had come out with a new methodology to detect mold. So it is really a good way, and that we later introduced that to the United States. So that is really a great opportunity where traditionally research and practitioners have been able to come together and seed that information across the world.
Yeah, it is a great series of conferences, Healthy Buildings, as well as the indoor air. And that is our partner, ISIAC, that is the responsible party for that. So it would be remiss not to mention that that's who's sponsoring these conferences. And I've learned many different things over the years simply by paying attention at these conferences and not just enjoying some fiendish food and drink. I actually learned something, and using that back in North America was really a plus for most people. So anybody who's interested in being ahead of their peers, this is the place to go. Is to go to one of these Healthy Buildings conferences. So
yeah, I've explained it to some folks. This is where the thought leaders come together and make some great cocktails.
Yes, exactly. So I hear what you said about the bioaerosols group. Thank you. Bioaerosols is one of the things that I think we really need to look at. But going back to the AIHA publications that you've been involved with, and particularly on Legionella, do you see where there may be additional need to update those, or are they in good shape at this point? Where do we stand with regards to the AIHA stuff?
Don, you make me you remind me of the current chair asking me, so when are we going to finish the update on the AIHA guideline?
Yeah.
So that unfortunately is in my ball court side of the court right now, and we are working diligently on updating that guidelines. One of the tough parts with even writing the guideline in the beginning, certainly updating it now, is that the rate at which new information and new guidelines and new standards are coming out is challenging, to say the least. By the time we think we've got everything ready, something else comes out that we now need to update it before we send it out. So that is currently on the agenda and on the on my to-do list, but updating that guideline. And one of the things that we're adding in there is, people love tables. And they will debate them to ad nauseum. But one of the things we've done in here is we've updated the table, and it's more harmonious with other guidelines, even the new CDC guidelines on interpretation of results. But we've added in a new recognition. Previously, we talked about what actions do you take if you detect Legionella in potable water sources? Well, traditionally, we've always thought of that as being potable water in the fixtures within the building. Well, one of the things I've certainly learned is that we want to look at what's coming in the building. So what do you do if you detect Legionella in the incoming water of the building? Something that hasn't transited or come through the building yet, certainly couldn't be a source of the building. Well, I can tell you the actions you can take are much more limited than if you think that source is within your own premise plumbing of or water heaters of your building. So that's another one in which we've added a little bit to the discussion and the recommendations, and are providing some guidance on reaching outside of your building, maybe back to your city water system, and letting them know your conundrum, that you're receiving Legionella from them. We'd appreciate it if you'd stop, and maybe send a little bit of more disinfectant in the water lines. And sometimes they can and are able to comply with that request.
I mean, one of the things that I know is near and dear to you is, it is trying to help get good information forward and move things, actually make substantial changes in a positive fashion in the industry. I know you've always been, heavy on that. And what do you think the main responsibility of researchers and practitioners are to ensure that there's a good flow of actionable, and that key word here, actionable information to and from both groups? There's a lot of information out there. There's tons of research. There's tons of data out there, tons of studies being done. But how do we actually make that be something that's actionable, that gets taken into practice? And how do we let the information that's gleaned in the practitioner side in the field get back to the research community to maybe postulate new research projects?
Yeah,
that's a way long question, but
that's a way long question. That's a few textbooks right there. I will say the first thing to solving a problem is to recognize you have one. And that has always been one of the toughest things, is to take that information from academia. And sometimes we do have that snarky reply as it's a very academic point, because it's maybe not relevant in the real world. But we need to increase the knowledge base and the relevance of all who are practicing in the field of public health or workplace health safety. So that's one thing, is we need to find a way to make sure that we bring people up to current standards of information. It often, unfortunately, means dispelling some myths. And there's a handful of academic papers out there that are constantly cited that have been proven demonstrably wrong. They need to be redacted or retracted. So that's one thing, is going back and fixing our old mistakes and being able to own up and recognize, that's what we thought back in 2003. Maybe we weren't right.
Well, things evolve. I mean, that's okay. That's like learning.
But people are still hesitant to acknowledge that they may have said something or published something wrong. So that's becoming more commonplace. And usually retractions of papers are a bit scandalous. And we need to kind of remove that from the discussion, that, something was, we thought we knew it back then, but, it turns out in hindsight, it might not have been the case. The other aspect is, how do you get information from practitioners? And those practitioners may be, folks like myself who are actually doing investigations and sample collection and interpretation, but also water treatment suppliers and providers, remediation firms. How do you gather that information and push that back into the academic side of things? And I think that's been frankly, the more challenging and most difficult upstream flow. I don't definitely call it upstream, but closing the loop. How do we take that information and push it back? And there's still a lot of, separating the wheat from the chaff.
There's not a good vehicle for doing that, though, right, David? I mean, currently, there really isn't a great vehicle.
Conferences certainly can be a way.
Okay.
But yeah, it's usually a one-way communication path, and I think academia really needs to, listen as much as they speak.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I'll put in a plug for our other partner, which is IEQGA, the Global Alliance. And this is a place where groups such as the International Society of Indoor Air Quality and Climate and others can work with practitioners from AIHA or from ACGIH, and now recently with IRCRC. So, I mean, basically, we're starting to see more interaction between the groups. And I think that's very, very important, because it really hasn't been the case in the past. So we need to foster that more. And I guess, David, the question I have for you on that is, on a personal basis, what would you like to see offered in the way of new conferences, webinars, other types of devices in order to bridge that gap?
I think really conferences are great, but for folks who make a living every day, usually, getting away for several days, and then certainly the age of COVID, it's not even been an option for the past couple of years now. But establishing reliable sources of continuing education that are palatable, that are engaging, that allow people to learn new things and improve their knowledge on the basis. I'll tell you, my personal wish is that when credentials are made, when certifications or licensures are required and established, that we stop making the mistakes of the past, and that we base those credentials and those licenses on knowledge. Now, everybody doesn't need to know everything about Legionella to make a difference. One of the things that we did in the framework, or the framework, technical framework for Legionella, is we recognize there are different roles that people play, and some are much more technically involved. Some are writing guidelines, but you need people who are able to collect good data and information in a safe and reliable way. And so I think really we're probably going to be seeing some type of credentials coming out. I'm not sure from who or if ever, but we do need to make it feasible for the customer, the hospital administrator or the plant manager, to be able to look at someone's business card or their website and know, okay, this person has basic competencies needed to do this. Because unfortunately, in many investigations that I've done, and some of them have been part of litigation support or expert witness work, we find that the first environmental firm, the local guys or gals who are called out to investigate something, they got in over their head, and often, expended resources, sometimes gave poor advice, sometimes sent people in the wrong direction and increased people's exposure to pathogens or chemical agents. So we do need that. In the past, the credential of Certified Industrial Hygienist was fully recognized both by government and private agencies as competent individuals. Now, you don't have competency in everything. I know some CIHs who are great in rocket fuels that I wouldn't want to take a bioaerosol sample, and vice versa. So we all need to practice within our own area of competence. And Legionnaires disease, Legionella, and waterborne pathogens in general is an emerging area of practice. And whether you're a CIH or a water treatment company, I think we all have the potential to increase our knowledge and our ability to help the clients and protect public health and safety.
We have another question from the audience. I'm going to flash that up. So how about attracting more young professionals into the industry? What groups are primed to give information to educational institutions to tell young people about IAQ to get them interested? That's a question that every organization is asking right now, right? All the silos in the indoor environmental arena.
Yeah. It's not, I have some young staff that work with me. Well, not young anymore, but we're young.
Younger than you.
Yeah, everyone's younger than me, it seems. And to a person, none of them had ever heard of industrial hygiene when they were in their undergraduate studies. Most of the folks who work for me have master's degrees. So it's not until they breach that level of master's program that they even hear this field exists. So I think certainly getting out into the high schools and the 4-year degree colleges is the first step to let people know that this field exists and is a growing field. The skills that we hold and possess are critical in providing good service and ensuring a safe environment, both for indoor air quality, buildings, workplaces, healthcare settings. So, I think really starting at the point at which people are gaining education, getting their basic education is where we need to go.
Because that question is one of the questions we've been asking too here at the publication too. It doesn't seem like there's a large influx of younger people coming into the space or the various silos, because there's a whole bunch of different silos, and it could just be because we're just not seeing them. They're not publicly, they're not visible. I mean, obviously, there's got to be younger professionals in the industry, as evidenced by your crew. But I'm just wondering. It seems like we have been in the industry a long time, collectively, the three of us here. We've been here quite some time, and we came in as the younger people years and years ago. But there hasn't seemed to be that same transition. I don't see the same. And it just could be me. I could be jaded, but I'm not seeing as much as I think we need to see. How do we? What can we do to help? Push it.
I think credentials or licensure or certifications have always driven the production pathway and process for that. So, the need for industrial hygienists and the end goal of having a certified industrial hygienist credential certainly prompted that. But I don't know the solution to that, other than people need to know we exist first, and then having a good professional pathway to for people to go down. People know how to, there's a pathway to become an MD. There's a pathway to become an engineer. There's not a clear pathway to become a CIH. And NIOSH has been rapidly, unfortunately, defunding and cutting budgets for its educational resource centers. So, government funding for those programs does have an impact. It may take 10, 20 years for it to come to fruition, but those budget cuts certainly have had an impact on where we are.
But I mean, I have noticed that AIHA over the past year plus has done some rebranding, which again, trying to be more reflective of what a CIH actually does. You're both CIHs, and yes, you probably do some work in occupational settings in the industrial environments, but I suspect that's not your primary areas of focus anymore.
Yeah, and that's pretty much true for the profession. I mean, when I started in the profession, 45 years ago or whatever it was, I do remember, but it just, it's 45 years. Okay. I just don't like to saying that. Basically, it was industrial. I mean, I went around and saw industrial facilities throughout in that case, the United States, for insurance companies. And that kind of market has completely dried up. Insurance companies don't employ that many industrial hygienists anymore. But I think that the key to it is really is more of a conversion. We each one of us probably started out and thinking we were going to be something else other than what we became. And now you still have that opportunity if you come out of school and you're a mechanical engineer, if you come out of school and you're public health masters, or if you come out of school and you're a biological student, biology student, you have an opportunity to become an industrial hygienist. It just isn't necessarily being offered as much as it was back in the day. For David, you're kind of a walking contradiction in the sense you're a CIH and a PhD. And so I was wondering what prompted you to go, not only for going for the CIH, but what prompted you to go for the PhD?
Well, I kind of went through this entire thing backwards. I started practicing public health after I completed my bachelor's in biology and was in the Army for several years. Mm-hmm. And the jobs that I had in the service, both working with troops and health and safety in the troops, but also my primary job was with special weapons. and we wanted to make, there's kind of dangerous things, and you want to make sure you weren't being exposed to the dangerous part of them. So the skills that we learned to check for rocket fuels and radionuclides and very dangerous chemicals were the same ones that I needed to check for carbon monoxide and for radon and I'll say real hazards, but typically, less hazardous materials. So that then prompted me to make the statement I've never thought I'd say. I wish I'd paid better attention in organic chemistry. And luckily, my employer really was supportive in me starting a master's program and then eventually going on with my doctorate. So I was working in the field at the same time as I was pursuing my graduate degrees. And so that, once I finished the doctorate, then I said, the credential of CIH is I just basically been studying for the past 6 years. And so was a bit of a no-brainer to go ahead and sit for that exam after completing the programs in environmental and occupational health. So I don't necessarily recommend that pathway. Makes you lose your hair, or at least turn gray. But it certainly allowed me to be very hyper-focused and intentional in what I needed to learn and study to research aspects that were directly related to my work and emerging issues that I saw happening in the field.
So we have a few more comments coming up on the chat in the global community. First one, I truncated a little. It's from Henry Slack, actually. How do we reach out to smaller businesses? They are vulnerable to those selling bad services for cheap. Think duct cleaning to solve every problem. Big biz will hire competent people to avoid lawsuits, but what about small businesses?
Well, greetings, Henry Slack. Long time no here. Voice from the past. How do we reach out to smaller businesses? Again, I think that is more of a public health communications, than it is to reach out to the small businesses themselves. We need to protect consumer confidence, and the Consumer Product Safety Commission, Federal Trade Commission really need to target in and frankly do their jobs to make sure that people are not being sold things that are fraudulent or being sold things that are dangerous. There are established regulatory processes and requirements for disinfecting agents and air cleaning devices, but unfortunately, many of them are just being bypassed. And even if they were being, and if you are going through some scrutiny as a manufacturer, you tend to be a little bit more cautious in what you say and claim. I don't think there's a one answer to everything, but in general, we do need government agencies that have that responsibility to carry it out and to make sure that we're publicizing that to the general public.
Yeah, I don't think we necessarily have as robust an architecture in place to protect the public and, both commercial and residential consumers. The FTC will come out if you make a false advertising claim, but the most they're going to do is fine a company. They can't take a product off the market. They can fine you for an instance of, deceptive advertising, but these companies rebrand and come right back.
I've seen consent decrees that made it, $10,000 per day per item sold. That's
but I can think back of an organization that made ozone generators for residential. Got fined $1 million and rebranded under a different name. Was out in 6 months, selling them again under a different label.
Yep.
Yeah. So, speaking of which, you were, if I remember correctly, the chair of the AIHA IEQ committee this past year in the age of COVID. Obviously, you didn't expect that you would be chair of the committee during that period, but what did you see change in the industrial hygiene profession with regards to indoor air quality since this new advent, this new age of COVID?
Well, by necessity, we had to change how we created and published public health guidance. Normally, the process that AIHA uses is very and I'll be kind, deliberative. we think and talk about things long before we put it out there, and that has merit. That is needed for most instances. But if you're dealing with a global pandemic and people are scrambling for answers, we had to come up with a more streamlined approach. And many of the back to work safely guidance documents and engineering controls to reduce the risk of COVID, infection prevention, and cleaning and disinfection guidance was pulled together in, frankly, record-breaking time by a small army of industrial hygiene volunteers who did it all over Zoom, all over remote meetings, when this would normally have been done in-person meetings or over the course of several years. And we did these often in weeks or months to get good, solid guidance out there to answer questions that many in the public and healthcare needed. I did have another question that came to me offline here from Paul Onder, asking about should the indoor air environment contain potable water humidification to protect human health. And part of that comes back to questions about humidity control in COVID, but also in many environments, especially in the wintertime, it becomes very dry, and drying out of the sinus cavities can lead to some issues. Humidification is a double-edged sword. Just because it's potable water doesn't mean it's contaminant-free or pathogen-free. And humidification can certainly cause problems within HVAC systems if it's not steam humidification. So just because it's potable water doesn't mean it's inherently safe. So there needs to be additional treatment and monitoring to make sure it's done properly.
Elaborate why steam is your preferred choice there.
Yeah, well, steam technically is more challenging because now you have precipitation of calcium and other materials, so you often have to treat that water before. But the heat of steam will make non-viable or non-infectious waterborne pathogens that may be in that water. Whereas if it's just a spray mist of water within the HVAC system or within the environment, the bacteria can still be infectious, and certainly in rare instances, but sometimes has been associated with a disease. So steam humidification overcomes the bacteria issue, but there are technical and engineering challenges for that.
We're getting to that point in time where we're almost at the end of the program, so I guess we'll give you an opportunity, David, to give some final thoughts, on how maybe we can, we should be moving forward here and taking this opportunity, with a greater awareness to indoor environments probably coming through the pandemic, and what you'd like to see going forward.
Well, we spend over 95% of our time in indoor environments of one sort or another. Most of them are rarely or lightly regulated or assessed. OSHA is a paper tiger. They've been defunded over the past few decades. And while they have published many threshold limits and requirements, we can't expect OSHA to come and save the day. Industrial hygienists and remediation contractors, academics, those are the voices that are being heard now. And I think that we need to, step up and ensure that we're putting out good, reliable, actionable information. And part of that is going to be the need to retract or go back on previous information and dispel some myths and improve the information that's out there.
I think well put. It's certainly, we need to take the opportunity and do this. And I think we really appreciate you taking the time out of your workday to be here during business hours and join us on the show. I just wanted to remind everyone that this broadcast, the Indoor Environments Global Research to Action, is a joint production of ISIAC, the International Society of Indoor Air Quality and Climate, and the Indoor Environmental Quality Global Alliance. Both these organizations came together to create this program, and it's a great thing. We're really excited to be here. This is our second installment, and we have more coming. Every month we'll be here.
I just wanted to remind that we also, as part of the IQGA, we sponsored this, but we also sponsored it through one of our members, which is AIHA, American Industrial Hygiene Association. And we really appreciate their support in putting this show together and getting us David Krause to speak to us. And I think it was a great show. And if you are available next month in August, there'll be an ISIAC representative that I have not as yet got full information, but it will be about the ventilation and ventilation in the age of COVID, most likely. So please join us again in a month. And Bob, if you want to wrap it up.
Yeah, it should be a great program. We're looking forward to that as well. And of course, again, another reminder on the Healthy Buildings America 2021 conference, Bridging the Gap Between Research and Practice, which again is what the whole basis of our program is here. This November 9 through 11 in Honolulu, Hawaii. Great event. We're all going to be there. All three of us will be there, and we hope to see all of you there as well. So
see you at the bar and have a nice drink.
Yeah, I mean, actually, instead of doing it virtually, we might actually be able to sit at the bar and have a drink. I
may have forgotten how to do that.
I don't believe so. But anyway, David, always a pleasure to speak with you. Don, again, thanks so very much for your time here and your efforts co-hosting. So until next month, we'll see you soon. Again, Indoor Environments, Global Research to Action. Have a great month.